There's a specific kind of rot that festers behind manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. It wears pastel polos and holds clipboards. When the Oak Creek Homeowners Association sent a letter stating my family didn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic, they expected us to pack up quietly or grovel. They saw a battered pickup truck, a rusty swing set, and a guy in stained denim. What they didn't see was the deed to the neighborhood. Here is how I dismantle an entire suburban fiefdom, one driveway at a time. Oak Creek was built on the bones of an old apple orchard, though you wouldn't know it to look at the place now. Every trace of character had been meticulously bulldozed, paved over, and replaced with identical two-story colonial knockoffs painted in varying shades of aggressive beige. The lawns were chemically sterilized into a vibrant, unnatural green. The driveways were immaculate. It was the kind of neighborhood where a slightly misaligned garbage can was treated like a moral failing. My wife, Sarah, hated it on sight. She was a woman who liked her life to have texture, scuffed hardwood floors, overgrown tomato plants, dogs that actually shed. But she loved the school district, and she loved our son Toby even more. So when Toby was diagnosed with a learning disability that required the kind of specialized resources only this specific, heavily funded public school could provide, we made the sacrifice. We didn't buy one of the beige boxes, though. We moved into the original farmhouse. It sat on a sprawling 3-acre lot at the dead center of the development, entirely swallowed by the surrounding sprawl of Oak Creek. Decades ago, when the original developer went bankrupt during a catastrophic market crash, I was a quiet, aggressive investor with cash on hand. I bought the farmhouse. Then, because the bank was desperate and the parcels were cheap, I bought a lot more. The developer eventually restructured and finished the neighborhood, but they had to build around my property. I had rented the old farmhouse out for years, waiting for the right time. Toby's school situation was the catalyst. Moving day was a spectacle. We didn't hire a pristine white-glove moving service. I drove our belongings over in my 15-year-old Ford F-150, a truck that had survived 3 hailstorms, 2 rear ends, and a lifetime of hauling gravel. It sounded like a dying tractor, and looked even worse. Sarah followed in her bruised Subaru. As we backed the trailer onto the cracked gravel driveway of the farmhouse, I could feel the neighborhood watching. Blinds twitched, sprinklers hissed in the silence. It didn't take long for the welcoming committee to arrive. I was wrestling a heavily scarred oak dining table out of the truck bed when I heard the unmistakable crunch of sensible shoes on my gravel. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and turned to see a woman standing at the edge of my property line. She looked like she had been assembled in a factory that produced passive-aggressive middle management. Her hair was a stiff platinum helmet. Her smile was a thin, bloodless line stretched tight across her face. She wore a peach-colored cardigan draped over her shoulders, the sleeves tied neatly across her chest. "Welcome to Oak Creek," she said. Her voice had the artificial sweetness of a diet soda. "I'm Brenda. I serve as the president of the Homeowners Association." "Nice to meet you, Brenda," I said, wiping a grease-stained hand on my jeans before offering it to her. She looked at my hand, as if it were holding a live grenade. She did not take it. Instead, she let her eyes wander past me, taking in the peeling white paint on the farmhouse porch, the wild, untamed rhododendrons flanking the steps, and the rusted swing set we had strapped to the top of the trailer. "We were quite surprised to see someone moving into the old Blight property," Brenda continued, dropping the smile entirely. "It's been an eyesore for years. We assumed the bank still owned it." "Not the bank," I said, leaning against the tailgate. "Just us." "I see." She pulled a pristine white envelope from her pocket and extended it toward me. "Oak Creek has a very strict set of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. We take our property values very seriously. We expect all residents to maintain a certain standard. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the rules, especially regarding commercial vehicles and exterior aesthetics." I glanced at the F-150. "It's not a commercial vehicle, just an ugly one." Brenda's eyes narrowed. The skin around her mouth tightened until it looked like cracked porcelain. "In Standards, she repeated, her voice dropping an octave. We are a community that values cohesion. We do not tolerate outliers. She turned on her heel and marched back down the street, disappearing into a house 3 doors down. A house that, ironically, sat on a parcel of land, whose deed was currently locked in a fireproof safe in my basement. I opened the envelope. It wasn't a welcome letter. It was a formal warning. According to the document, my grass was 3/4 of an inch above the mandated height. My gravel driveway was an unapproved material, and my truck was a detriment to the visual harmony of the street. It gave me 48 hours to rectify the issues or face fines. Sarah walked out onto the porch, carrying a box of kitchen supplies. She took one look at my face and sighed. Let me guess, we're already in trouble. I folded the paper and slipped it into my back pocket. I looked down the street, watching the identical sprinklers sweeping across the identical lawns. I thought about the files in my safe. I thought about the quiet, invisible lines of ownership that crisscrossed this entire development, tying it all back to me. No, I said, a slow, cynical smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. We're not in trouble, Sarah, but Brenda is about to have a very bad year. The notices didn't stop. They multiplied. It was as if the Oak Creek HOA had declared a quiet, bureaucratic war on my family, weaponizing 3-ring binders and carbon copy forms to wage their campaign. Within the first month, our mailbox became a daily source of hostility. They fined us $50 because Toby left his bicycle on the front porch for 2 hours while he ate lunch. They fined us $100 because the shade of white I used to touch up the farmhouse trim wasn't on the pre-approved heritage color palette. They hit us with a $200 penalty, claiming the wind chimes Sarah hung from the oak tree constituted a noise nuisance. It was a systematic attempt to make us so uncomfortable, so financially frustrated, that we would simply pack up and leave. They were trying to bleed us out with 1,000 petty paper cuts. I paid none of them. I just tossed them into a manila folder on my desk, watching the stack grow thicker week by week. Sarah, however, was struggling to find the humor in it. She was a deeply empathetic person, and the sheer weight of the neighborhood's silent judgment was beginning to wear on her. When she walked down the street with our dog, people would cross to the other side. If she waved at a neighbor pulling into their driveway, they would suddenly become intensely focused on their steering wheel. It was a master class in suburban isolation. They look at us like we're an infection, Sarah said one evening, standing at the kitchen window and watching a slow-moving SUV crawl past our house, its driver clearly inspecting our yard for infractions. Toby asked me today why the kids next door aren't allowed to play with him. What am I supposed to tell him? That their parents think our house is too ugly? That was the line. You can't insult my truck, you can fine me for my grass, but when you make a 7-year-old kid feel like a pariah in his own home, the rules of engagement change. The cynical amusement I had been nursing evaporated, replaced by a cold, dense anger. The climax of their harassment campaign happened on a suffocatingly hot Tuesday afternoon in late July. I was underneath the F-150, trying to coax a few more months of life out of the alternator, when 2 pairs of shoes stopped at the edge of my driveway. One pair was a set of pristine white tennis shoes. The other was a pair of expensive Italian leather loafers. I slid out from under the truck, wiping engine grease onto a rag. Brenda stood there, flanked by a man I hadn't met yet. He was tall, aggressively tanned, and wore a polo shirt tucked into khaki shorts with a braided leather belt. He had the kind of face that looked like it spent a lot of time yelling at teenage customer service workers. "Can I help you?" I asked, not bothering to stand up entirely, just leaning back on my mechanic's creeper. "This is Ken," Brenda said, crossing her arms. "He's the vice president of the HOA. We are here to hand-deliver your final notice." Ken stepped forward, thrusting a thick, legally binding-looking document toward me. "You owe the association $4,200 in unpaid fines and late fees," he barked, his voice loud enough to ensure the neighbors trimming their hedges could hear every word. "You have completely ignored our citations. You have made no effort to bring this property up to the neighborhood standard. You don't belong here, pal." I took the envelope, feeling the weight of the paper. 4,000. That's a lot of wind chime violations, Ken. "It's not a joke," Ken snapped, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You think you can just move into Oak Creek, trash the aesthetic, and ignore the board? We have attorneys. We have bylaws. This notice gives you 14 days to pay the balance in full and cure all property defects. If you do not, we will place a lien on this house. We will foreclose on you. We will take this property, and we will sell it to someone who respects the community." Brenda offered a smile that was pure venom. "It would be much easier for everyone if you just put the house on the market now. We have real estate agents on the board who would be happy to waive their commission just to expedite your departure." They weren't just trying to bully me. They were openly attempting to steal my home through bureaucratic extortion. It was a common enough tactic for out-of-control HOAs, banking on the fact that most working-class families couldn't afford to fight a protracted legal battle and would simply fold under the threat of losing their equity. They looked so proud of themselves, so utterly convinced of their own untouchable authority. I looked at Ken's expensive loafers, then up at his flushed, arrogant face. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. The trap was set, and they had just eagerly marched right into the center of it. "A lien," I repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the humid air. "You're going to put a lien on the farmhouse." "And we'll win," Ken said, puffing out his chest. "We've done it before." "I see," I said, standing up and tossing the greasy rag onto the hood of my truck. "Well, I wouldn't want it to come to that." "When is the next board meeting?" Brenda's smugness faltered for a fraction of a second, surprised by my sudden apparent capitulation. "Thursday night, 7 p.m. at the community clubhouse. But you aren't on the agenda." I don't need to be on the agenda," I interrupted, my voice dropping the casual, friendly tone I had maintained since moving in. It was flat, hard, and entirely devoid of warmth. "I'll be there. Make sure the entire board is present. We have a lot of paperwork to go over." I turned my back on them and slid back under the truck before they could respond. I didn't need to see their faces to know they were smiling. They thought I was coming to beg for a payment plan. They thought they had won. They had no idea that they didn't even own the ground they were standing on. Down in the basement, the air smelled like damp concrete and old paper. The heavy steel door of my fireproof safe clicked open with a satisfying metallic thud, echoing in the quiet of the subterranean room. Inside, sitting beneath our passports and birth certificates, were 3 thick, leather-bound folders. They held the ghosts of the 2008 financial crisis, the precise legal architecture of my quiet revenge, and the literal foundation of Oak Creek. 15 years ago, the original developer of this land, a wildly over-leveraged man named Greg, went spectacularly bankrupt before a single beige house was ever framed. The bank panicked. They began liquidating the master-planned community in chunks, desperate to recoup pennies on the dollar. Most investors saw a toxic wasteland of half-graded dirt and walked away. Looking at the plats and zoning maps, a different picture emerged for me. I didn't buy the individual lots where the houses would eventually sit. I bought the veins and the organs. I purchased the 3-acre farmhouse lot at the absolute center, and then, through a blind LLC named Red Dirt Holdings, I bought the unpaved access roads, the community park parcel, and the large tract at the entrance meant for the neighborhood clubhouse. When a new development firm finally swooped in 4 years later to resurrect Oak Creek, they realized they had a massive problem. They owned the plots for the houses, but they didn't own the roads connecting them, nor did they own the land for the amenities they were promising buyers. To avoid a drawn-out legal nightmare, they came to me. We struck a deal. Red Dirt Holdings leased the roads and the clubhouse parcel to the newly formed Oak Creek HOA on a 99-year agreement for a nominal fee of $1 a year. But the lease came with a master covenant, a poison pill I had my attorneys draft very carefully. The lease remained valid only as long as the HOA did not enact any restrictions, fines, or rules that interfered with the quiet, unencumbered enjoyment of the original central farmhouse property. If they breached that master covenant, Red Dirt Holdings retained the right to revoke the lease, sever access, and reclaim the land. They signed it without a second thought. To the new developers, I was just a stubborn holdout with a farmhouse. They assumed the HOA would just ignore my property and focus on their beige empire. They never anticipated Brenda and Ken. Upstairs, the sound of silverware scraping against ceramic pulled me back to the present. I carried the folders up to the kitchen, setting them gently on the counter. Dinner was a quiet, heavy affair. Sarah was pushing a piece of roasted chicken around her plate, her eyes dark and exhausted. Across the table, Toby was unusually still. Normally a ball of kinetic energy, our son sat hunched over his food, staring at his glass of milk. "Dad," Toby asked, his small voice breaking the silence, "are we poor?" The question hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I set my fork down carefully, feeling the anger I had been suppressing flare hot and sharp behind my ribs. "No, buddy, we aren't poor. Why would you ask that?" Toby shrugged, his narrow shoulders rising and falling in a defeated motion. "A kid at the bus stop told me his mom said we belong in a trailer park. He said our house is a dump and we can't afford a real car. He said we ruin everything." Sarah closed her eyes, pressing 2 fingers hard against the bridge of her nose. I could see the faint tremor in her jaw as she fought back tears. This was the true cost of suburban warfare. It wasn't just letters in the mail. It was the casual, cruel indoctrination of children to hate the people who didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. Walking around the table, I pulled a chair right next to him. I put my hand on his shoulder, waiting until he looked up at me. "Listen to me, Toby. People like that kid's mom, they think worth is measured by how much your house looks like everyone else's. They think rules and matching paint colors make them important. But they don't. We live here because we chose to, and nobody gets to tell us we don't belong. Tomorrow things are going to change, I promise you." He offered a small, hesitant nod, taking a bite of his dinner. Sarah looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. I just tapped the leather folders on the counter. Thursday evening arrived with a stifling, oppressive humidity. The neighborhood was quiet as I walked down the cracked asphalt of the street, the leather folders tucked securely under my arm. I didn't dress up. I wore the same faded denim and worn-in work boots I always wore. Putting on a suit would mean acknowledging their authority, stepping into their arena on their terms. I was bringing my own arena. The Oak Creek Clubhouse was a monument to manufactured prestige. It featured faux stone pillars, a needlessly massive chandelier visible through the front windows, and perfectly manicured hedges flanking the heavy oak doors. Inside, the main meeting room was packed. Word had clearly spread. The folding chairs were filled with neighbors, their faces a mix of curiosity and eager anticipation. They were here for a public execution. At the front of the room sat a long folding table, draped in a maroon tablecloth. Brenda sat in the dead center, a thick binder open in front of her, her platinum hair catching the harsh, fluorescent light. Ken was to her right, wearing a smug, self-satisfied grin, chatting animatedly with a thin, nervous-looking man in a cheap suit, who I recognized from neighborhood gossip as David, the HOA's retained attorney. A fourth board member, a quiet woman named Susan, sat on the far left, looking uncomfortable. The low hum of neighborhood gossip died the second I walked through the double doors. Dozens of heads turned, eyes dragged up and down my work clothes. The silence was thick, heavy, and openly hostile. Brenda looked up from her binder. The corners of her mouth twitched upward in a predatory smirk. She tapped a wooden gavel against the table, the sound cutting through the quiet room. "Right on time," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Please find a seat in the big case. We will get to your disciplinary hearing shortly." I didn't sit in the back. I walked straight down the center aisle, feeling the hostile glares of 50 people burning into my back, and stood directly in front of their folding table. "Let's not waste time, Brenda," I said, my voice carrying easily across the silent room. "Let's skip the agenda and get right to the part where you try to steal my home." The wooden gavel struck the table again, harder this time. Brenda's face flushed with a sudden surge of indignant rage at the interruption. "You are out of order," she snapped, leaning forward. "This board operates on strict parliamentary procedure. You will wait until the public comment period, or I will have you removed for trespassing on community property." Ken chuckled, leaning back in his chair and interlacing his fingers behind his head. "Come on, Brenda, let the guy speak. He's about to lose his house. The least we can do is let him complain about it before we file the paperwork." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd behind me. These people weren't just bystanders. They were active participants in the culture Brenda and Ken had built. They wanted to see the man with the rusty truck publicly humiliated. "Fine," Brenda said, closing her binder with a sharp snap. "Let the minutes reflect that we are advancing the enforcement agenda. We have issued 14 separate citations regarding the severe blight of your property. Unapproved fencing, improper vehicle storage, lawn neglect, and a complete disregard for the community architectural standards. The total fines exceed $4,000. Your 14-day grace period is up." She looked to David, the attorney, who awkwardly shuffled a stack of papers. "As the board's legal counsel, David has drafted the lien," she continued, her eyes locking onto mine with triumphant malice. "We will be voting to attach this to your deed tonight. Once the lien is secured, we will move immediately for foreclosure." "You're not going to vote on anything tonight," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I dropped the first leather folder onto the maroon tablecloth. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud right in front of the lawyer. "David, is it?" I asked. "Before your clients put themselves in immense legal jeopardy, I suggest you open that folder and read the first document." David blinked, glancing nervously at Brenda, who gave a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand. Reluctantly, the lawyer opened the folder. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the first page. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then a slow, creeping pallor washed over David's face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly under the fluorescent lights. His eyes darted back to the top of the page, reading it again, his lips moving silently. "What is it?" Ken demanded, annoyed by the lawyer's sudden silence. "Just a sob story? A bankruptcy filing?" David swallowed hard. His hand actually trembled as he pushed the paper toward Ken. It's a deed of exemption," David stammered, his voice cracking. "And a municipal zoning plat from 2012. "Speak up, David," Brenda hissed. "The farmhouse," David said, his voice rising slightly in panic. "It isn't part of the Oak Creek subdivision. Legally speaking, it exists as an independent, unannexed county parcel. When the new developer filed the final plat for this neighborhood, the farmhouse was explicitly excluded from the restrictive covenants. The HOA has no jurisdiction over that property." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the commercial-grade carpet. Ken stared at the paper as if it had burst into flames. "That's impossible. We've fined the previous renters before." "You illegally extorted the previous renters before," I corrected, leaning my palms flat against their table. "And they paid because they were scared of you. But I'm not renting, and I'm not scared of you. Every single fine you've issued is fraudulent. Your threat of foreclosure is a textbook case of extortion, under color of authority." Brenda's jaw worked furiously. The platinum helmet of her hair seemed to vibrate with sheer fury. "This is a trick," she sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I don't care what that piece of paper says. You're sitting right in the middle of our neighborhood. You use our roads. You are bound by the community standards, even by proxy. David, tell him he's bound by proxy." David looked terrified. He was a small-town lawyer who handled fence disputes and barking dog complaints. He was entirely unequipped for this. "Actually," I said, cutting off whatever pathetic defense David was about to mount, "that brings us to the second folder." I tossed the second leather binder onto the table. It slid to a stop directly in front of Brenda. "Go ahead, Brenda, open it." She glared at me, refusing to touch it. Ken snatched it up instead. Flipping it open, he stared at the densely typed legal jargon, his tanned face scrunching in confusion. "What the hell is Red Dirt Holdings?" Ken muttered. "That would be me," I said, standing up straight and addressing not just the board, but the entire room of silent neighbors behind me. "When the original developer went bankrupt, I bought the unpaved parcels. The roads you drive your luxury SUVs on, I own them. The community park where you don't let my son play, I own it. And the ground beneath this very clubhouse, I tapped the table hard with my knuckles. I own it. Gasps erupted from the back rows. Several people stood up, craning their necks to see the documents. You're lying, Brenda whispered, her voice stripped of all its former confidence. She sounded breathless, panicked. Read the lease agreement, David, I commanded. The lawyer leaned over, his eyes scanning the second document. He's right. The roads and amenities are leased to the HOA by Red Dirt Holdings. A 99-year lease. So what? Ken shouted, slamming his hand on the table, trying desperately to regain control of the room. You have a lease. Big deal. You can't change the terms. We pay our $1 a year and we control the property. You have no power here. Keep reading, David, I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. Read Section 4, Paragraph B, the Master Covenant Clause. David traced his finger down the page. When he found the paragraph, he stopped breathing for a second. He looked up at me, absolute horror in his eyes, realizing exactly what I had done. Read it out loud, I ordered. David cleared his throat, his voice shaking violently. The lessor, Red Dirt Holdings, retains the absolute right to unilaterally terminate this lease, without penalty or delay, should the lessor, the Oak Creek HOA, attempt to enforce any restriction, penalty, or covenant upon the central farmhouse parcel, or otherwise interfere with the quiet enjoyment of said property. David dropped the paper, looking at Brenda with the expression of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. By issuing those fines and threatening a lien, David whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, you breached the master covenant. He has the legal right to revoke the lease right now. Panic has a very distinct sound. It isn't a scream, and it isn't a shout. It is the collective, breathless rustle of 50 people simultaneously realizing their entire world is built on a foundation of sand. In the Oak Creek clubhouse, that rustle swept through the folding chairs like a sudden draft. The residents who just minutes ago were eager for a public execution were now staring at the board table with wide, terrified eyes. Brenda looked physically ill. The aggressive diet soda sweetness had completely melted from her face, leaving behind the pale, slack expression of someone who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to notice. Ken, however, was incapable of processing defeat. His ego simply wouldn't allow it. Bullshit, Ken barked, spit flying from his lips as he leaned across the table. Total, utter bullshit. You can't just take the roads. People live here. We have deeds. The city wouldn't allow it. The police wouldn't allow it. You're trying to bluff a room full of professionals with some fake paperwork. David, the attorney, shrank back into his cheap suit. He didn't look at Ken. He kept his eyes glued to the master lease agreement. Ken, the plats are recorded with the county clerk. I recognize the filing stamps. It's not a bluff. The HOA doesn't own the infrastructure. Red Dirt Holdings does. By enforcing action against the farmhouse, you triggered the penalty clause. Then we untrigger it, Ken yelled, slamming his hand down so hard the gavel bounced onto the floor. We drop the fines, we tear up the lien. Problem solved. Walking slowly along the edge of their table, I let my boots thud heavily against the commercial carpet. You don't get to unpull a trigger, Ken. That's the thing about traps. Once they snap shut, apologizing to the steel teeth doesn't get your leg back. I stopped in front of the quiet board member, Susan. She looked absolutely mortified, her hands twisted together in her lap. I felt a brief flash of pity for her. She was just a bystander who probably joined the board to help plan neighborhood block parties, only to be dragged into Brenda's petty tyranny. But pity didn't change the paperwork. Reaching into my back pocket, I pulled out the third, slightly thinner folder. I didn't drop this one on the table. I handed it directly to David. What is that? Brenda whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising hum of panicked murmurs from the crowd. That is a formal, notarized notice of lease termination, I said, turning to face the room. Effective immediately. As of 7:43 p.m. tonight, the Oak Creek Homeowners Association no longer holds a valid lease for the streets, the park, or this building. You are currently trespassing on private property. Chaos erupted. Several people in the back rows stood up and began shouting at once. A man in a golf shirt shoved his way into the aisle, pointing a trembling finger at Brenda. What did you do, Brenda? The man screamed, his face purple. "You told us this guy was just some deadbeat. You told us we were just cleaning up the neighborhood." "We were," Brenda shrieked back, standing up and gripping the edges of the table as if it were a life raft. "We were protecting our property values." "You just lost our property values," a woman in the second row yelled, clutching her purse to her chest. "If he owns the roads, how do we sell our houses? Who is going to buy a house they legally can't drive to?" That was the kill shot. The absolute, brutal truth of the situation finally settled over the room. Suburban wealth is entirely tied up in home equity. These people had poured their life savings into these beige boxes, banking on the promise of an appreciating asset. But a house is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it. Without guaranteed legal access to the public highway, without a community park, and with an unhinged HOA that just nuked its own infrastructure, every single home in Oak Creek was effectively unsellable. The property values didn't just drop, they evaporated. Ken stood up, kicking his folding chair backward. "We'll sue you. We'll tie you up in litigation for 10 years. You won't see a dime, you smug son of a bitch." "Sue me with what money?" I asked, my voice calm, cutting through his rage like a scalpel. "David, how much does the HOA have in its reserve fund?" The lawyer flinched. "About $70,000. "And how much is my daily use fee for the roads, now that the lease is terminated and we revert to a month-to-month commercial trespass rate?" David swallowed hard, pulling a calculator out of his briefcase. He punched in a few numbers, his face turning an even sicker shade of green. "According to the default provisions in the Red Dirt Master Contract, $500 per lot, per day." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. There were 80 houses in Oak Creek, $40,000 a day. The HOA would be entirely bankrupt in less than 48 hours. "You see, Ken, you wanted a war of attrition," I said, leaning in close so only the board could hear the venom in my voice. "You wanted to bleed my family out with $50 fines for wind chimes and grass length. You tried to make my 7-year-old son feel like garbage because we didn't fit your aesthetic. You wanted to take my home, so I took your neighborhood." I turned my back on the board and faced the terrified crowd. The shouting died down instantly. They looked at me not with disgust, but with raw, unadulterated fear. I was no longer the guy with the rusty truck. I was the landlord of their entire existence. "I strongly suggest you all walk home," I told the crowd. "Because starting tomorrow morning, any vehicle parked on my streets without a Red Dirt Holdings parking pass will be towed at the owner's expense. And Brenda?" I glanced back over my shoulder. She was crying now, silent tears streaking down her heavily powdered cheeks, ruining her pristine makeup. "Leave the keys to my clubhouse on the table. You have 10 minutes to clear out." Friday morning arrived with the heavy, humid stillness of a freshly bombed battlefield. Sunlight crept over the manicured roofs of Oak Creek, illuminating a neighborhood that had fundamentally changed overnight. Down at the clubhouse, the heavy oak doors were chained shut. A thick steel padlock glinted in the morning light, securing a bright yellow sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing, Red Dirt Holdings." I had been up since 4 in the morning with a hired contractor, sinking steel posts into the ground at the entrance of the community park. A chain-link gate now blocked the entrance to the playground, secured with an identical lock and sign. Sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, I drank my coffee and watched the neighborhood wake up to its new reality. Sarah stepped out through the screen door, wrapping a thick cardigan tightly around her shoulders despite the summer heat. She held a steaming mug in both hands, her eyes scanning the quiet street. We hadn't talked much when I got home from the clubhouse last night. I had simply placed the keys on the kitchen counter, kissed her forehead, and told her it was done. "It's too quiet," Sarah murmured, sinking into the wicker chair next to mine. Usually by 7 in the morning, Oak Creek was a hive of aggressive suburban activity. Landscapers with roaring leaf blowers, residents jogging in expensive athletic wear, convoys of luxury SUVs idling at the bus stops. Today, nothing moved. It was the paralyzing stillness of a besieged city. "They're reading the emails," I said, taking a slow sip of black coffee. At midnight, David the attorney had mass emailed the entire resident directory, confirming everything that happened at the meeting. He formally resigned as their counsel in the very same email, citing an untenable conflict of liability. He also attached the fee schedule for trespassing on Red Dirt Holdings property. Just then, a sleek black Mercedes backed slowly out of a driveway 2 houses down. It stopped at the edge of the asphalt. The driver, a man I recognized from the meeting, stared at the street as if it were lined with landmines. He sat there idling for 5 full minutes, terrified to put his tires on my road, before finally throwing the car back into park and retreating into his house. He had done the math. Driving to work meant violating the commercial trespass rate. By noon, the civil war had officially begun. The first casualty was the HOA board itself. We watched from the porch as a furious mob of neighbors gathered on Brenda's pristine front lawn. They weren't carrying clipboards this time. They were carrying printed copies of the master lease and recall petitions. Voices carried easily across the quiet neighborhood. I could hear Ken screaming from his own driveway, trying to shift the blame to Brenda, claiming she acted unilaterally when she drafted the foreclosure threat. Brenda, locked safely inside her house, simply closed the blinds. The exact same tactic she had used when my family first moved in. The irony was thick enough to pave a driveway with. "Are you really going to tow their cars?" Sarah asked, watching the crowd swarming Brenda's lawn. Her voice held a mixture of awe and slight unease. She was a kind person, and witnessing the complete destruction of these people's lives was a heavy thing to process. "I don't have to," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "I just have to let them think I will." Fear does all the heavy lifting. They're locked in a prison made entirely of their own bylaws. The real vindication, however, came later that afternoon. The yellow school bus wheezed to a halt at the corner stop. Usually, Toby walked home alone, his head down, while the other children clustered together, whispering and pointing at the boy who lived in the blight property. Today was different. Toby stepped off the bus, dragging his backpack in the dirt. Behind him, a woman in a sharp business suit was waiting at the stop. It was the mother of the kid who had told Toby we belonged in a trailer park. She caught Toby by the shoulder, gently, and knelt down to his eye level. From the porch, I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I saw her son, a pudgy kid in a branded polo, shuffle forward, looking at his shoes. He mumbled something to Toby. Toby looked surprised, then offered a small, hesitant smile and nodded. The mother patted Toby's arm, shot a terrified, deferential glance toward our farmhouse, and quickly ushered her son away. Toby ran all the way down the gravel driveway, his sneakers kicking up dust. He bounded up the porch steps, his face flushed and glowing with an energy I hadn't seen in months. "Dad, Mom," he yelled, dropping his backpack heavily onto the wooden deck. Ryan apologized. He said he was sorry about what he said about our house, and his mom said I can come over and play video games this weekend. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling instantly in her eyes. She reached out and pulled Toby into a tight, desperate hug, burying her face in his shoulder. "That's wonderful, buddy," I said, feeling a tight knot in my chest finally begin to unravel. "She also asked if you were going to turn the park into a parking lot," Toby added, looking up at me with innocent confusion. I told her I didn't know. I let out a harsh, barking laugh, shaking my head. "No, Toby, we aren't going to pave the park. In fact, I think we're going to open it up tomorrow, just for the kids." The HOA's authority was broken, shattered into 1,000 useless pieces of paper. They had spent years using arbitrary rules to make people feel small, to hoard power in a tiny suburban kingdom. Now they were trapped in a legal cage of my design, desperate for mercy from the man with the rusty truck. I wasn't going to evict them. I wasn't going to bankrupt every single family in Oak Creek. But before I signed any new easements, before I let them access their clubhouse or drive freely on my roads, things were going to change. The neighborhood covenants were going in the trash. The approved color palettes were dead. The fines were erased. Starting tomorrow, I was going to paint my front door a bright, obtrusive, entirely unapproved shade of blue. And not a single person in Oak Creek was going to say a damn thing about it. Monday morning brought the ultimate capitulation. It didn't come in the form of a legal letter or a shouting match. It arrived as a solitary man, walking up my gravel driveway, clutching a thick plastic binder to his chest like a makeshift shield. His name was Paul. He lived 4 doors down in a corner lot house with immaculate hydrangeas. In the 6 months we had lived here, he had never once spoken to me, always opting to stare intensely at his phone whenever Sarah and I walked past. Today he looked entirely hollowed out. His posture was slumped, his khakis were wrinkled, and the crisp, aggressive arrogance that usually defined Oak Creek's residents was entirely absent. He looked like a tired man who just wanted to go to work without fear of bankruptcy. I was sitting on the top step of the porch, a mug of black coffee resting on my knee. I didn't stand when he approached. I just watched him navigate the cracked gravel, his expensive loafers kicking up small clouds of gray dust. "Good morning," Paul said, his voice cracking slightly. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, maintaining a cautious distance. "Paul," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Are my wind chimes acting up again?" He winced, closing his eyes for a brief second. "Please, we're done with all that. I came to talk about the roads and the park." "Where are Ken and Brenda?" I asked, resting my forearms on my knees. "Con," Paul breathed, shaking his head. "Ken packed his car on Saturday afternoon. He told his wife he was going to a hotel. But the rumor is he listed the house with an institutional cash buyer company. He's washing his hands of it. Brenda won't answer her door for anyone, but a moving pod was dropped off in her driveway last night. The board is completely dissolved." "And you?" "I'm just a guy who got drafted by the rest of the street to come beg for mercy," Paul said, offering a weak, self-deprecating smile. "Nobody else wanted to face you. We held an emergency neighborhood meeting in my garage yesterday. It was a bloodbath. Everyone is terrified. People are talking about losing their retirements, losing their equity. We need access to our homes. We need the community park back." He slowly extended the heavy plastic binder toward me. It was the Oak Creek Master Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, so the holy text of the Beige Bastion. "We held a vote," Paul continued, his hand trembling slightly. "A unanimous vote of all remaining homeowners. We struck the CCRs, all of them. We dissolved the Architectural Review Committee. We erased the fines ledger. The HOA, as it exists now, will only collect $50 a month for snow removal and basic landscaping of the common areas. That's it. Nobody will ever tell you what color to paint your house, where to park your truck, or how tall your grass can be. We just want a normal neighborhood." I looked at the binder. 300 pages of micromanagement, elitism, and petty tyranny, all neatly printed on heavy stock paper. It represented everything wrong with this modern, sterilized version of suburban life. I didn't take it from him. Instead, I pointed toward the heavy, galvanized steel trash can sitting at the edge of my garage. "Throw it away," I said quietly. Paul blinked, confused. "What?" "If you want me to sign a new deed of easement for the roads, I need to see you throw that binder in the garbage. You do that, and the gate comes off the park by noon." Paul looked down at the heavy binder. He looked at the trash can. A profound wave of relief washed over his face, erasing years of manufactured suburban stress in an instant. He walked over to the can, lifted the metal lid, and dropped the binder inside. It hit the bottom with a loud, hollow thud. "Done," Paul said, dusting his hands on his pants. "I'll have my attorney draw up the new easements today," I told him, finally standing up and offering him my hand. "Tell the neighborhood they can stop hiding in their houses." Paul took my hand, shaking it firmly. "Thank you, truly. We forgot how to just be neighbors." By mid-afternoon, the oppressive silence of Oak Creek finally broke. It wasn't the roar of leaf blowers or the aggressive revving of luxury engines. It was the sound of children. I unchained the gate to the community park, and within 20 minutes, the playground was swarming. I walked back to the farmhouse and pulled a heavy metal can out of the bed of my F-150. I popped the lid with a flathead screwdriver. The sharp, acrid smell of acrylic paint cutting through the humid summer air. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, carrying a plastic tray and 3 rollers. She wore a pair of old, paint-splattered sweatpants, her hair tied back in a messy knot. Toby trailed right behind her, vibrating with excitement. I dipped my brush into the can and pulled it out, thick with a shade of bright, electric, unapologetic blue. It was a color that screamed against the muted beige of the neighborhood. It was messy, vibrant, and entirely alive. "You ready?" I asked Toby, handing him a smaller roller. "Can I do the bottom half?" he asked, his eyes wide. "You can do whatever part you want, buddy," I said, stepping back to let him at the front door. We spent the next hour covering the peeling white wood in a layer of brilliant blue. It was sloppy work. Toby managed to get more paint on his elbows than he did on the trim, and Sarah kept laughing every time she had to wipe a stray blue smudge off his nose. Out on the street, cars drove past. A few slowed down. Neighbors peered out of their windows, taking in the sight of the loud, rule-breaking front door sitting right at the heart of their community. A week ago, it would have triggered a barrage of citations and angry knocks. Today, nobody stopped. Nobody stared with judgment. Paul drove past in his Volvo, tapped his horn twice, and offered a simple, friendly wave. I waved back, leaning against the porch railing with a paint-covered hand. The beige bastion had finally fallen, and in its place, something far better was taking root. A place where grass could grow a little too long, where rusted trucks could leak a little oil, and where a family could just exist, safely anchored to the ground beneath their feet. There you have it, the complete dismantling of a suburban dictatorship, all thanks to a rusty truck, a little bit of petty tyranny, and a 2012 zoning plat hidden in a fireproof safe. Power trips are funny things, and neighborhood clipboard warriors usually crumble the second they encounter actual, undeniable authority. If you loved watching Brenda and Ken's beige empire collapse into a pile of voided covenants, smash that like button. Share this with anyone who has ever suffered under a tyrannical HOA. And don't forget to subscribe for more deeply satisfying stories of quiet, calculated retribution. See you next time.